He thought humiliating her in front of the board would prove his authority, but he had no idea he was about to expose just how little power he actually had. The glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor gleamed under the soft morning light, Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond it, a city built on ambition and quiet deals made behind closed doors. Inside, executives in tailored suits sat around a polished walnut table, their voices low, confident, rehearsed. This was where decisions worth millions were made in minutes, where reputations were built or quietly dismantled. And at the far end of the room, unnoticed at first, sat a woman who didn't seem to belong. Emily Carter wore a simple navy blouse and modest slacks, her hair pulled back neatly, no designer labels, no attempt to impress. She placed a worn leather notebook on the table and observed, her eyes steady, her posture calm. No one greeted her. No one asked her name. To them, she was just another assistant who had wandered into a room meant for people far above her station. Richard Holloway, the CEO, stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding, his voice smooth with practiced authority. At 52, he carried himself like a man who had never been questioned, his tailored charcoal suit fitting like armor, his confidence filling the room. He spoke about leadership, about company culture, about respect, words that sounded polished, convincing, almost noble. But his eyes, sharp and restless, scanned the room for something else, control. And then they landed on her. He paused mid-sentence, just long enough for others to notice. "Excuse me," he said, his tone shifting, the warmth fading into something colder, more precise. "I don't believe we've met." The room turned, attention snapping toward Emily like a spotlight. She looked up calmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Emily Carter," she said softly. A simple answer. Too simple for a room like this. Richard tilted his head slightly, a faint smile forming, not of kindness, but of amusement. "And your role here is?" he asked, the question hanging in the air longer than necessary. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle smirks appearing, the kind that spread quietly when someone is about to be put in their place. Emily didn't rush to answer. She closed her notebook gently, her movements unhurried, as if time worked differently for her. "I'm here to observe," she replied. The silence that followed was thin, fragile, then broken by a quiet chuckle from across the table. Richard let out a soft laugh, shaking his head as if indulging a harmless mistake. "Observe?" he repeated, his voice now carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. "This isn't exactly an entry-level environment." A few more laughs followed, low but unmistakable. The room began to shift, the subtle energy of discomfort turning into something sharper, something closer to entertainment. Richard stepped closer to the table, resting his hands lightly on its surface, his gaze never leaving her. "Let me be clear," he continued, his tone firm, polished, cutting just beneath the surface. "This meeting is restricted to senior leadership, people who understand the weight of the decisions being made here." He gestured lightly around the room, the skyline behind him reflecting in the glass like a stage set. "So unless you can explain why you're sitting at this table," his voice trailed off deliberately, inviting her to fill the silence, to justify her presence, to prove she belonged. The room waited, every eye on her, and for the first time, the air felt heavier, charged with something no one could quite name. Emily didn't look away. She didn't shrink. She simply sat there, her expression unchanged, as if she had already seen how this moment would end. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of that room, something invisible had just begun to crack. The silence did not break the way Richard expected it to. It did not collapse into apology or nervous explanation. Instead, it stretched, slow and deliberate, as if the room itself was waiting to see who would move first. Emily Carter remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her closed notebook, her expression composed in a way that did not match the tension building around her. Richard studied her more closely now, the faint amusement in his eyes sharpening into something more calculating. He was used to quick reactions, to people scrambling under pressure, eager to justify themselves. But she did not move, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. He straightened slightly, adjusting his cuff as if resetting the moment back into his control. "Observe," he repeated, slower this time, letting the word linger with a hint of disbelief. "That is an interesting choice of words." A few members of the board shifted in their seats, their earlier smirks fading into cautious curiosity. Something about her stillness was beginning to disrupt the rhythm of the room. Richard stepped away from the head of the table and began walking along its edge, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor. "You see," he continued, his tone smooth again but edged with quiet pressure. "This company is not a classroom. It is not a place where people simply sit in and watch. Every person here has earned their seat." He paused just across from her, resting one hand lightly on the back of a chair, his gaze fixed directly on hers. "So I will ask you again. What exactly qualifies you to be here?" The question landed heavier this time, no longer wrapped in humor, but in expectation. Around the table, eyes flickered between them. Some leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift. Others avoided looking at her altogether, as if distancing themselves from whatever outcome was coming next. Emily took a quiet breath, almost unnoticeable, and then looked around the room, not with uncertainty, but with calm awareness, as if she were taking note of each person, each reaction, each silence. When her gaze returned to Richard, there was no challenge in it, only clarity. "I did not realize qualification was determined by volume," she said softly. The words were not loud, but they carried. The kind of sentence that did not demand attention, but took it anyway. A subtle ripple moved through the room. Someone shifted in their chair. Another cleared their throat. Richard's expression tightened, just slightly, a crack in the polished surface. He let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was less ease in it now. "Careful," he said, his voice lowering, more controlled, more deliberate. Confidence without context can be misleading. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she opened her notebook, flipping to a page already filled with neat, precise notes. Columns, bullet points, observations. Not the scattered scribbles of someone trying to keep up, but the structured record of someone evaluating. She ran her finger lightly down the page, as if confirming something already known. Then she closed it again. "Context is exactly why I am here," she replied. The room grew still again, but this time it was different. The earlier tension had shifted into something quieter, heavier. No one laughed now. No one moved. Even the skyline beyond. The glass seemed frozen in place. Richard's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he masked it, stepping back and folding his arms. He had intended to make an example out of her, to reinforce the hierarchy, to remind everyone who controlled the room. But now, something subtle had changed. The control he relied on was no longer absolute. It hovered, uncertain, like a balance that had not yet tipped, but was dangerously close. And though no one said it out loud, there was a growing sense, deep beneath the surface of that boardroom, that the woman they had dismissed moments ago was not there by accident. And whatever reason had brought her to that table had not revealed itself yet. The tension no longer belonged to a single moment. It had settled into the room like a quiet storm, invisible but impossible to ignore. Richard Holloway felt it before he acknowledged it, a subtle shift in the way people were sitting, in the way their attention no longer followed him automatically. He had built his authority on certainty, on the unspoken understanding that when he spoke, others followed. But now, there was hesitation, and hesitation was dangerous. He exhaled slowly, forcing a measured calm back into his expression as he turned away from Emily and addressed the rest of the board. "Let us stay focused," he said, his voice regaining its practiced rhythm. "We have a quarterly performance review to complete." A few members nodded quickly, grateful for the return to structure, to something familiar. Laptops opened. Papers shifted. The illusion of normalcy attempted to reassemble itself. But it did not fully return, because every few seconds, someone's eyes flicked back to her. Emily Carter did not speak again. She did not interrupt. She simply watched. And that, more than any argument, began to unravel the room. Richard moved through the presentation, clicking through slides projected onto the large screen at the front. Revenue growth, operational efficiencies, expansion forecasts. Numbers filled the air, precise and confident. But something in his delivery had changed. His words were still sharp, but the pauses between them had grown slightly longer, as if part of his attention remained anchored behind him. "As you can see," he continued, gesturing toward a chart, "our leadership strategy has positioned us for sustained dominance in the next fiscal cycle." The phrase hung there, polished and deliberate, sustained dominance. Emily's eyes lifted briefly to the screen, then back to him. Her expression did not change, but she made a small note in her notebook. The movement was subtle, but it caught the attention of a woman seated 2 chairs down, who instinctively leaned forward just a fraction, trying to glimpse what had been written. Richard noticed that too. His jaw tightened again. He clicked to the next slide more quickly than intended. We have also implemented internal evaluation measures to ensure that every department meets our standards of excellence, he added, his tone slightly sharper now, as if reinforcing control through language. A man near the end of the table raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, uncertain. That hesitation would not have happened an hour ago. Richard saw it, and he felt it. The room was no longer entirely his. Emily turned another page in her notebook, her pen moving with quiet precision. No wasted motion, no visible reaction, just observation, documentation, assessment, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Finally, Richard stopped speaking. Not because he had finished, but because the silence had returned again, uninvited and heavier than before. He turned back toward her, unable to ignore it any longer. "You seem to be taking this very seriously," he said, the edge in his voice carefully controlled but unmistakable. A few heads turned again. The attention shifted back to her, drawn by something no one could quite define. Emily looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm steadiness. "I always do," she replied. No explanation, no apology, just a statement that carried more weight than it should have. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then he gave a small, dismissive nod, as if concluding something in his own mind. "Then perhaps you would like to contribute," he said, his tone now sharpened with intent. "Since you are observing so closely." There it was. The next move. The escalation he believed would restore the balance. The invitation that was not an invitation at all, but a challenge designed to expose her, to force her into the open where he could regain control. The room leaned in, almost imperceptibly, waiting, watching, and for the first time, the outcome did not feel certain. For a brief moment, no one moved. The invitation hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, like a line drawn that could not be erased. Richard Holloway stood at the head of the table, his posture composed, but his eyes fixed on Emily Carter with a quiet intensity. He had made his move, one he had used countless times before. Put someone under pressure, force them to speak, let them reveal their limitations. It always worked. It had to work. Emily did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just a little longer, as if measuring it, as if understanding exactly how much weight it carried. Then, slowly she stood. The sound of her chair moving against the polished floor was soft, but in that moment, it felt louder than anything that had been said. Every eye in the room followed her, not out of curiosity anymore, but something closer to anticipation. She placed her notebook on the table, leaving it behind as she stepped forward. No rush, no hesitation, just a steady, unhurried movement that did not match the tension surrounding her. Richard watched closely, his expression controlled, though something behind his eyes had begun to sharpen. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment she would either justify herself or expose herself. And either outcome, he believed, would restore the balance. Emily stopped a few feet from the head of the table, not quite taking his position, but not avoiding it either. She did not reach for the presentation remote. She did not look at the screen. Instead, she looked at the people in the room, one by one, calm, direct, as if she were the one evaluating them now. A subtle shift passed through the board. Shoulders straightened, expressions tightened. No one spoke. "You mentioned leadership strategy," she said at last, her voice even, clear, carrying without effort. It was not loud, but it filled the space in a way that demanded attention. Richard folded his arms, a faint, tight smile forming. "I did," he replied, "and I would be very interested to hear your perspective." The words sounded polite, but the tone beneath them was unmistakable. This was still a test. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "Your projections assume stability in executive decision-making," she continued, her gaze steady. "But your internal turnover rate in the last 12 months suggests something else." The room went still. Not the polite silence from earlier. This was different. This was recognition. A man near the middle of the table glanced down at his tablet, quickly scrolling, as if confirming something he had not expected to hear out loud. Richard's smile did not disappear, but it faded just enough to reveal tension beneath it. Turnover is a natural part of growth, he said smoothly. We have addressed those concerns internally. Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering the answer. Have you? She said quietly. Not a challenge. Not an accusation. Just a question that lingered longer than it should have. A woman seated near the window shifted in her chair, her eyes moving between them. Someone else cleared their throat. The atmosphere had changed again, but this time it was undeniable. This was no longer about a misplaced observer. This was something else entirely. Emily took a small step to the side, just enough to glance at the screen displaying the company's projections. Your growth curve assumes alignment. She continued, her tone steady. But alignment cannot exist where there is no trust. The words landed with precision. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just exact. Richard's jaw tightened, barely noticeable, but it was there. He stepped forward slightly, closing the distance between them, his voice lowering. And you believe you understand the internal dynamics of this company well enough to make that assessment? He asked. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. I believe I understand what is being overlooked, she replied. The room fell silent again. Not uncertain this time. Not curious, but heavy, because something had shifted beyond control. And for the first time, it was no longer clear who was being evaluated. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the room with a weight no one could ignore. Richard Holloway held her gaze, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that would confirm what he had already decided about her. But there was none. Emily Carter stood with the same quiet composure, as if the tension surrounding her did not exist, or perhaps as if she had already accounted for it long before stepping into that room. A faint shift moved through the board members, subtle but unmistakable. A man near the end of the table adjusted his glasses, glancing down at his tablet again, this time not out of curiosity, but concern. A woman seated across from him pressed her lips together, her earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious. Richard exhaled slowly, then gave a small, controlled nod, as though acknowledging a point he did not fully accept. Insightful, he said, his tone measured, though the edge beneath it had not disappeared. But insight without authority is just speculation. The sentence was delivered cleanly, deliberately, meant to re-establish the hierarchy, to remind everyone where the lines were drawn. A few heads nodded reflexively, clinging to the structure they understood. Authority, position, title, the invisible rules that defined who spoke and who listened. Emily did not react immediately. She let the words settle, the same way she had let every other moment in that room unfold. Then she turned slightly, her gaze moving across the long table, taking in the faces now watching her more carefully than before. Authority, she repeated softly, as if considering the word itself, is only meaningful when it is recognized. The statement was simple, almost quiet, but it shifted something again. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. Richard's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before he masked it, stepping forward just slightly, closing the space between them. And you believe it is not recognized here? He asked, his voice lower now, controlled, deliberate. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. I believe it is assumed, she replied. A silence followed that was different from the ones before. This was not uncertainty. This was realization beginning to form, slow and incomplete, but present. A man near the center of the table leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, his attention no longer divided. Another executive glanced toward the door, as if expecting something, though nothing had been announced. Richard noticed that too. He straightened, his posture firm, his presence expanding again as he turned slightly toward the rest of the board. We are losing focus, he said, his tone sharper now. This meeting is not about philosophical interpretations of leadership. His words were meant to redirect, to pull the room back into alignment. But the alignment did not fully return, because the question had already been placed, and it could not be removed. Emily reached for her notebook again, but instead of opening it, she held it lightly in her hands, as if it were no longer necessary. You are right, she said calmly. It is not. She paused, just long enough for the room to settle into that agreement. Then she continued. It is about accountability. The word landed with precision. A different kind of weight. One that did not rely on volume or authority to be understood. Richard's jaw tightened again, more visibly this time. Accountability is exactly what we are discussing, he replied, though his voice carried a sharper edge now, less controlled than before. Emily gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without conceding anything. Then perhaps it should apply equally, she said. The room went still, completely still. No shifting, no quiet murmurs. Even the faint hum of the city beyond the glass seemed to fade, because in that moment, the conversation had crossed a line. Not loudly, not aggressively, but unmistakably. And though no one spoke it out loud, there was a growing awareness, shared silently across that table, that whatever position Emily Carter held in that room, it was not the one they had assumed. And whatever authority Richard Holloway believed he controlled, it was no longer absolute. The word accountability did not fade. It settled into the room like a final piece placed on a board no one realized they were playing on. Richard Holloway did not respond immediately this time. For the first time since the meeting began, there was a visible pause in him. Not long, not dramatic, but enough for those watching to notice. He shifted his weight slightly, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table as if grounding himself back into the authority he had never questioned before. Careful, he said at last, his voice lower, more controlled, but carrying a sharper edge than before. You are stepping into territory that requires more than observation. The sentence was not loud, but it was deliberate, a warning carefully framed. Around the table, the atmosphere tightened again, but now it was different. Not anticipation of embarrassment, but anticipation of something deeper, something unresolved. Emily Carter did not step back. She did not soften. Instead, she took a single, measured step forward, closing the distance just enough to stand parallel with the center of the table. Not at the head, not beneath it. Equal. The shift was subtle, but everyone felt it. I am aware, she said calmly. No defensiveness. No hesitation. Just acknowledgement. Richard studied her again, more carefully now, as if recalculating something he had overlooked. The confidence she carried did not match her position, did not match her appearance, did not match the assumptions that had been made about her the moment she walked into the room. And yet, it was there, unshaken. Then perhaps you should also be aware, he continued, his tone tightening slightly, that this company operates on structure, on defined roles, on clear lines of responsibility. He gestured lightly around the table, reinforcing the invisible hierarchy that had always held firm. Without that, there is no stability. A few board members nodded, though more cautiously now. The words were familiar, but the certainty behind them had begun to weaken. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finished, she gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a point already considered. Structure is important, she agreed. The agreement came easily, almost disarming in its simplicity. Richard's expression shifted slightly, expecting resistance, not alignment. But she continued. But structure without accountability creates distance, she said. And distance creates blind spots. The words were precise. Not aggressive, not exaggerated, just exact. A man near the far end of the table leaned forward now, no longer hiding his attention. Another executive folded her hands, her gaze fixed entirely on Emily. The room was no longer divided. It was focused. Richard's jaw tightened again, more visibly now. You are making broad assumptions, he replied, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier ease. Emily held his gaze. I am identifying patterns, she said. Silence followed. Not empty silence, but heavy, layered with unspoken recognition. Because what she was describing, some of them had seen it too. They had just never said it out loud. Richard took a slow breath, then straightened, reclaiming what control he could. And what exactly do you believe is being overlooked? He asked, his tone measured again, but with a sharper undercurrent. This time, the question was different. Not a trap. Not entirely. It carried something else now. Curiosity. And perhaps, just beneath it, uncertainty. Emily did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the screen, then back at the room, her eyes moving across each person as if confirming something one last time. Then she spoke. The cost, she said quietly. The word hung in the air, simple but incomplete. A few brows furrowed. Someone shifted in their seat. Richard narrowed his eyes slightly. Cost of what, he asked. Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged. The cost of decisions made without understanding who they affect, she replied. The room went completely still. Because this time, it was no longer abstract. It was specific. And though no one moved, no one spoke, there was a growing awareness spreading through the room, slow but undeniable, that this conversation had moved beyond performance, beyond hierarchy, beyond control. And whatever came next was no longer something Richard Holloway could predict. The word cost did not leave the room. It lingered in the silence, pressing against every polished surface, every composed expression, until it no longer felt like a question, but a truth waiting to be acknowledged. Richard Holloway held his position, his eyes fixed on Emily Carter, but something in his expression had shifted. The confidence was still there, but it was no longer effortless. It was maintained, calculated, controlled. Every decision has a cost, he said finally, his voice steady, though the edge had returned, sharper now. That is the nature of leadership. A few heads nodded again, more out of habit than certainty. The phrase was familiar, almost rehearsed, the kind of statement that usually closed conversations, not opened them further. But Emily did not step back from it. She did not challenge it directly. Instead, she let it stand for a moment, allowing its weight to settle before she spoke again. That is true, she said quietly. The agreement came again, calm and measured, but it did not resolve the tension. It redirected it. But not every leader understands the cost they are passing on. The words were precise, and this time, they did not stay contained between the two of them. They moved through the room, landing differently on each person. A man near the center shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around a pen. Another executive looked down at her notes, then back up, her expression no longer neutral. Richard's jaw tightened again, more visibly now. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them just enough to reassert presence, to remind the room who was supposed to hold control. "And you believe you do?" he asked, his voice lower, more direct. The question was no longer a test. It was a challenge. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe I see what is being ignored," she replied. The room went quiet again. But this time, the silence was heavier than before, layered with something deeper than curiosity or tension. It was awareness beginning to take shape. Richard exhaled slowly, then turned slightly, addressing the board once more, as if reclaiming the structure that had begun to slip. "We are discussing performance metrics," he said, his tone firm, deliberate. Not abstract interpretations of impact. But even as he spoke, the words did not carry the same authority they had earlier. Because now, the room was listening differently. Not just to him, to her. Emily did not interrupt. She simply waited. And when the silence returned again, she spoke, her voice steady, unchanged. "Then let us talk about performance," she said. She turned slightly toward the screen, her gaze moving over the data displayed there. "Your expansion into 3 new markets increased short-term revenue by 12%, she continued. A few heads lifted, surprised by the specificity. But internal reports show a 23% increase in employee attrition in those same regions. A man near the far end of the table froze mid-movement, his hand hovering over his keyboard. Another executive looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the numbers. Richard's expression tightened further, the shift now undeniable. "Those figures are part of a larger strategic adjustment," he said, his voice controlled, but the ease was gone. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding it. "And the adjustment assumes that loss is temporary," she said. "But patterns suggest otherwise." The words landed cleanly, without force, without emphasis. That made them harder to dismiss. A woman near the window leaned forward slightly, her attention fully fixed now. Someone else exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but present. The room was no longer divided. It was aligned, but not in the way Richard had intended. Emily took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, as if the point had already been made. "Performance is not just what is gained," she added softly. "It is also what is lost." The sentence settled into the room, deeper than anything before it. And this time, no one moved. No one spoke. Because the realization was no longer forming. It was there, clear, unavoidable. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard Holloway was not the one controlling where the conversation would go next. No one rushed to fill the silence this time. It held the room in place, steady and undeniable, like a truth that had finally surfaced and refused to be pushed back down. Richard Holloway stood still, his usual confidence no longer moving the room the way it once did. His presence was still strong, still practiced, but it no longer commanded automatic agreement. Because now, every word he spoke was being measured, compared, questioned, and that had never happened before. He turned slowly toward the large screen, as if anchoring himself back to the data, to something concrete, something he could still control. Short-term adjustments always come with volatility, he said, his voice even, but the certainty behind it was thinner now. That is the price of expansion. A few board members nodded, but the motion was slower, less certain. One executive glanced down at her notes, then back up at Emily, her expression no longer neutral. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It was established. Emily Carter did not move immediately. She allowed the statement to exist, to be heard, to be processed. Then she took a small step toward the screen, not asking permission, not seeking approval, just stepping into the space as if she had always belonged there. The movement alone drew every eye in the room. She did not touch the remote. She did not change the slide. Instead, she looked at the numbers already displayed. Volatility is expected, she said calmly. But repeated patterns are not volatility. They are indicators. The words were measured, deliberate, and they landed differently now. Not as opinion, as evaluation. A man near the center of the table leaned forward further, his attention fully engaged. Another executive slowly folded her hands, no longer pretending to multitask. Richard watched her closely, his expression tightening, but he did not interrupt. Not this time. Because interrupting now would not restore control. It would expose the loss of it. Emily turned slightly, her gaze moving back to the room. When the same outcome appears across multiple regions, she continued, it is no longer a temporary effect. It is a structural issue. The room went still again, but this time, it was not just silence. It was alignment. Not with Richard, not fully with Emily, but with the realization that something important had been overlooked, and it was now impossible to ignore. Richard took a slow breath, then stepped forward, reclaiming space beside her, though not quite overtaking it. You are drawing conclusions without full context, he said, his tone controlled, but the strain beneath it was no longer hidden. Emily met his gaze. Then provide the context, she replied. The simplicity of the response shifted everything again. Because now, the expectation had changed. It was no longer about her proving she belonged. It was about him proving that his leadership could withstand scrutiny. A quiet movement near the door broke the stillness. The sound of it was subtle, but in a room this silent, it carried. Several heads turned instinctively. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, followed by a woman holding a slim folder. Their presence was calm, deliberate, official, not rushed, not uncertain, just precise. Richard's eyes flicked toward them for a fraction of a second, then back to Emily. But that single glance did not go unnoticed. The room shifted again, attention splitting, tension rising in a new direction. The man approached the table without hesitation, stopping just short of the center. He did not speak immediately. He simply placed the folder down with quiet care. The sound was soft, but it echoed. Emily glanced at it briefly, then back at Richard, her expression unchanged. Context, she said softly. The word was no longer a question. It was an answer waiting to be revealed. And as the room held its breath, something deeper than tension settled in. Not uncertainty, not curiosity, but realization, just on the edge of becoming undeniable. No one reached for the folder. Not at first. It sat at the center of the table like something that did not need to demand attention to control it. The man who had placed it there stood quietly, his posture composed, his presence calm in a way that carried authority without needing to announce it. The woman beside him remained still, her hands lightly clasped, her expression neutral but precise. Richard Holloway's gaze shifted from the folder to the man, then briefly to Emily Carter, and for the first time, there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Not confusion, not yet, but recognition beginning to form, slow and unwelcome. This meeting is in progress, Richard said, his voice measured, though the control in it had changed. It was no longer effortless. It was deliberate. The man gave a small, respectful nod. Yes, he replied calmly. And this is part of it. He opened the folder with careful precision, turning it so that it faced the board. Pages slid into view, clean, structured, official. The top sheet carried a heading that several members recognized immediately, though none spoke it out loud. Ownership structure. A subtle shift moved through the room, quiet but undeniable. One executive leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. Another adjusted his posture, no longer relaxed. Richard's jaw tightened as his gaze dropped to the page. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning, confirming, rejecting, then slower, and then still. The room went completely silent. Emily did not move. She did not step forward. She did not look at the folder again. She simply stood where she was, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if this moment had never been a question, only a matter of time. Richard lifted his head slowly, his gaze returning to her, but this time, it was different. The authority he had carried was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. The certainty was gone. This, he began, his voice lower now, the words not forming as easily as before. He stopped, recalibrating, searching for ground that no longer felt stable. The man beside the table spoke again, his tone even. Effective immediately, all executive decisions are subject to review by the majority stakeholder. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be, because their meaning was already understood. A faint sound moved through the room, not quite a reaction, not quite a breath, but something in between. Richard's gaze returned to the document, then back to Emily. And in that moment, the realization was no longer forming. It was complete. Majority, he repeated quietly, as if the word itself required confirmation. Emily met his gaze, calm, steady, without hesitation. I believe you were asking about qualification, she said softly. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke, because everything had already been said. Richard froze mid-thought, his posture still, his expression caught between disbelief and understanding. The structure he had relied on, the hierarchy he had enforced, the authority he had never questioned, had just shifted. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. Emily took a small step forward, not to claim the head of the table, but simply to stand where she had always belonged. You spoke about leadership, she continued, her voice calm, unwavering. I was listening. The words landed with quiet precision. No anger, no accusation, just truth. Richard did not respond. He could not, because for the first time in that room, he was no longer the one being followed. He was the one being evaluated. And as the silence settled, deeper and heavier than before, something became clear to everyone present. Authority had never been about who spoke the loudest. It had always been about who understood the weight of their decisions. And in that moment, the room finally recognized who truly did.